The men who chopped off heads for a living had a highly specific, chilling pre-work dietary ritual to numb themselves to the job. You've been told that medieval executioners were just ruthless psychopaths who enjoyed the slaughter, but the truth is much darker. Severing a human spine with a heavy axe took an immense psychological toll, and to keep from losing their mind, these men relied on a heavy, highly intoxicating pre-work meal. The most terrifying part? That meal was usually paid for by the very person they were about to kill. Now, you might be wondering why on earth anyone would buy their own killer a drink right before having their head chopped off. The answer is completely horrifying. It involves a secret, highly toxic chemical cocktail that pushed the human nervous system to the absolute brink of total failure. By the time we finish this journey, you are going to see exactly what happened to Henry VIII's most powerful advisor when this dark ritual went violently, disgustingly wrong. But to understand the sheer panic and desperation of this job, we have to travel back to darkest, most miserable corners of Tudor London. Close your eyes and imagine the absolute worst smell you possibly can. We are in the 1500s. The air wrapping around the Tower of London is a thick, choking soup. It is a suffocating slurry of coal smoke, rotting river mud, and the sharp, hot stench of open sewers. It is the dead of night, hours before the sun even thinks about coming up, and the damp alleys near St. Catherine's are pitch black. Right here, on the very edge of the Tower Liberty, sits a nameless, filthy alehouse. Inside this tavern, the air is heavy. It reeks of stale rushes scattered on the floor, the greasy smoke of rendered mutton fat dripping from cheap tallow candles, and the sour, overwhelming tang of fermenting grain. And sitting alone in the corner of this foul-smelling room is a man who is entirely isolated from the rest of humanity. He doesn't sit with the early rising laborers. He doesn't share a joke with the sailors coming up from the Pool of London. He is a ghost among the living. He is the professional headsman. This man is a walking contradiction. He is the ultimate, terrifying instrument of the monarch's absolute power. Yet society treats him like a walking moral contagion. People won't look at him. People won't touch him. And right now, sitting in this dim tavern, he is preparing for work. But his pre-work routine is not about getting motivated. It is a desperate act of chemical preservation. The absolute core of this man's daily existence and the darkest, most closely guarded secret of the entire Tudor justice system is the terrifying reality of functional intoxication. Let me make this completely clear. The executioner does not approach the wooden block with a clear mind or a steady, sober hand. That is a myth. That is Hollywood. The reality is that if he went up there sober, the execution would be a disaster. His morning begins with him downing massive, staggering quantities of something called liquid bread. This is not the light, fizzy beer you get at a modern pub. This is a thick, unhopped ale. It is literally a dense, opaque porridge made of fermented malt and oats. Often, when it is slammed down on the wooden table in front of him, it is still in a state of active fermentation. It is bubbling. It has a thick, yeasty froth on top. This liquid bread serves a very specific purpose. It acts as the extreme caloric foundation for the brutal physical labor he is about to form. He needs raw, explosive energy to swing a heavy steel axe, and this bubbling porridge provides it. But here's the twist. The ale is merely the carrier. The alcohol and the calories are just the baseline. The true, terrifying essence of this morning ritual lies in what happens next. It is a process called spiking. The headsman infuses his thick ale with a highly potent, incredibly dangerous cocktail of medicinal herbs known in the underworld as the dwale. This is not a casual drink to take the edge off. This is a highly sophisticated, incredibly dangerous application of early modern herbalism. The term dwale had been used since the time of Chaucer to describe a state of torpor, a literal death-like trance. It was originally used as a hardcore surgical anesthetic, but the executioners adapted it to treat their own specific psychological trauma. They needed a chemical barrier to stand between their human conscience and the sickening violence they had to inflict. To really grasp what is happening inside the headsman's brain, we have to break down the exact pharmacology psychology of this nightmare brew. Think of it as a recipe for intentional insanity. Ingredient number 1 is black henbane. This is a vicious little plant that contains tropane alkaloid, specifically things like scopolamine, hyoscyamine. When the headsman drinks this, these chemicals violently block the neurotransmitters in his brain. What does that feel like? It induces a trance-like state that people at the time called divine madness. It creates total sensory suspension and a profound dissociation from reality, but most important, it muffles his hearing. When he stands on that stage later, the henbane ensures that the terrified screams of the crowd and the crying of the victim sound like they are 1,000 miles away. He feels like he is flying, completely detached from the wooden planks beneath his boots. Ingredient number 2 is poison hemlock. Yes, actual poison, the same stuff that killed Socrates. Hemlock contains choline alkaloids that cause peripheral motor paralysis by blocking nicotinic actions in the body. Why in the world would an executioner paralyze himself? It's all about the dose. In low, perfectly titrated amounts, the hemlock is used to deaden the peripheral nerve endings in his fingers and arms. It's meant to steady his terrified tremors, but it's a massive gamble. If the publican mixes the dwale just a tiny bit too strong, the hemlock will trigger total respiratory failure, and the executioner will suffocate right there in his tavern chair. And the third ingredient is the opium poppy. This targets the opioid receptors in his brain, flooding his system with intense analgesia and a massive wave of sedative euphoria. The opium is there to completely suppress the human fight or flight response. When you see a human being with their neck exposed on a wooden block, your instinct is to run or to help. The opium forces the executioner to remain unnaturally calm in the face of the victim's final, desperate pleas. It allows him to look at the visceral, horrific reality of the blood and feel absolutely nothing. And the final ingredient, kicker that pulls it all together, boar's gall, literal pig bile. They pour raw bile into the drink because it acts as a powerful emulsifier for the herbal alkaloids. The bile radically increases the absorption rate of the drugs into his bloodstream. It accelerates the onset of the dwale state, ensuring that the headsman doesn't peak too early or too late. It guarantees he reaches maximum functional delirium exactly as he climbs the wooden steps of the scaffold. When you combine all these toxic herbs with the heavy ethanol and the thick ale, you get a very specific, dangerous type of functional drunkenness. But there's a massive catch. The henbane causes a paradoxical reaction in the body. It makes you unbelievably thirsty. So the more the headsman drinks to numb his mind, the thirstier he becomes, which forces him to drink even more of the spiked ale. It's a vicious, escalating cycle of intoxication. By the time the bells of St. Peter ad Vincula start tolling to announce the execution, the man holding the axe is operating in a state of high-functioning delirium. His basic motor skills are barely kept online by the massive caloric load of the liquid bread, but his higher cognitive functions, his morals, his fear, are almost entirely extinguished by the dwale. Are you starting to see why this job was a nightmare? But wait, because the darkest part of this entire system hasn't even been mentioned yet. Let's go back to the hook. How is this incredibly expensive, highly specialized cocktail being paid for? The Crown, despite ordering the executions, was notoriously cheap. They provided a standard, completely miserable fee for the executioner's services. That tiny sum of money was rarely enough to cover the massive quantities of high-gravity ale, the expensive opium, the high-grade henbane, and the dense meat he needed. The darkest twist of the Tudor justice system is that the executioner's heavy, numbing meal was almost always secretly paid for by the victim's own family. They called it the mercy bribe. It was a final, agonizing financial transaction. The family wasn't tipping him for good service. They were desperately funding a pharmacological state to ensure the headsman was perfectly steady enough to perform a clean, single strike. The families living in Tudor London fully understood the reality of the block. They knew that a sober executioner was a massive danger. A man fully aware of the moral weight of his actions is a man who hesitates. If he walks up there sober, the reality of the violence hits him. His hands start to shake under the onset of moral injury, panics.
On the other hand, if the executioner is just a regular drunk, perhaps blasted on cheap, thin beer provided by the state, he becomes clumsy, his balance goes, his aim is skewed by ataxia, and the swing is a disaster. The mercy bribe was mathematically calculated to fund the perfect middle ground. The families paid for a deep pharmacological numbness that was heavily supported by the sheer strength of the liquid bread and massive plates of salted meat. Let's look at exactly what the family was buying for this pre-work breakfast. They were purchasing gallons of high-gravity ale, heavily loaded with oats to guarantee a sustained.
They were paying top coin for the medicinal additives, forcing the publican to source expensive opium and henbane from a specialized apothecary. And they were buying huge slabs of dense, salted pork or beef. Why the meat? Because the heavy animal fats were absolutely necessary to slow the absorption of the massive amounts of alcohol, preventing the headsman from simply passing out on the scaffold before the job was done. This bribe was a literal insurance policy against the horrors of a botched execution. The family was buying the hope of a quick death. But history proves that this dark economy didn't always work out. Sometimes the balance failed, and when the mechanics of the duel failed, the results were ripped straight from a horror movie. In just a few minutes, we will look at exactly what happens when an executioner's chemistry completely breaks down on the stage. But to truly grasp why these executions went wrong, you have to understand the severe physical toll of holding that axe. Being a professional headsman in the 1500s wasn't just psychologically destroying, it was physically devastating. If you watch a movie, beheading looks like a single, effortless, swift motion. But for the man actually swinging the weapon, it was a feat of extreme, brutal mechanical stress. Tudor-era execution axes were not precision samurai swords. They were incredibly heavy, top-heavy wedges of thick steel. They usually weighed between 5 and 7 pounds. They were not designed to slice. They were designed to crush and sever by maximizing downward force through pure, unstoppable momentum. Because of this, the headsmen suffered from a horrific range of chronic orthopedic conditions. If they went to a doctor today, they would be diagnosed with severe occupational injuries. To swing the axe accurately, the executioner had to adopt what was called the scaffold stance. This was a very wide, deeply braced posture. He had to stand like this to maintain perfect balance on a timber platform that was often completely slick with fluids from previous execution. This wide stance placed immense, tearing strain on the patellofemoral joints in his knees and massive compression on his lumbar spine. Every time he swung that heavy axe downward, he was subjecting his L4 and L5 vertebrae to brutal compression forces. Over the years, this led to chronic lumbar degenerative disc disease. The lateral stress on his knees from constantly shifting his weight while swinging a 7-pound weight caused severe osteoarthritis and massive joint instability. And that is just the lower body. Think about his arms. He had to hold a heavy steel wedge perfectly steady while aiming at one specific tiny vertebra on the neck of a victim who might be squirming or shivering in terror. Doing this required massive isometric tension in his rotator cuffs and all the small muscles of his forearms. And remember the chemicals? The chronic intoxication from the duel was destroying him from the inside. Years of drinking tropane alkaloids and insane amounts of ethanol caused permanent neurological damage. It gave him peripheral neuropathy. He developed chronic, permanent tremors. He permanently lost his fine motor control. This is the ultimate tragic irony of the executioner. The very drugs he drank to stop his hands from shaking on the job eventually caused permanent shakes he could never get rid of. Add in his daily diet of highly salted meat and poor hydration, and his cardiovascular system was constantly strained, leaving him at massive risk for a stroke or heart failure right there on the scaffold. This horrifying reality created what we can call the headsman's paradox. To successfully perform the job, the man desperately needed raw physical strength and a perfectly steady hand. However, the job itself, combined with the extreme chemical coping mechanisms he had to use to survive it mentally, systematically destroyed his body and completely ruined his motor skills. As the years ground on, a professional headsman slowly mutated into a ragged and butcherly figure. His movements became stiff and robotic, locked up by agonizing joint pain. His aim was
entirely compromised by the permanent brain damage caused by the very dwell that kept him from going completely insane. This physical decay is the real, hidden reason why so many Tudor executions were horrifically botched. It wasn't always because the executioner lacked the will to do it. Often, it was simply a mechanical failure of his failing, poisoned body, unable to execute the exact physics required to cleanly sever a human head. And this brings us to the psychological burden. The moral weight carried by the professional headsman was entirely unique in the strict Tudor social hierarchy. He wasn't like a soldier on a battlefield killing in the chaotic heat of combat. He wasn't a common street murderer killing out of passion or greed. The headsman killed as part of a highly choreographed ritual of power and penance. He was the literal, physical personification of the monarch's final decree. This role forced him into an impossible psychological state. He had to be completely present to physically swing the axe, but he had to be completely absent mentally to survive the guilt. He was just a physical machine performing an act, while the actual human being inside was chemically suppressed by the hemlock and opium. Modern psychologists would say he suffered from extreme moral injury. This happens when a person's core ethical beliefs are systematically and repeatedly violated by the duties of their job. To avoid snapping, the headsman built massive psychological defenses. The first defense was professional dissociation. The dwell allowed him to step outside of himself. He could stand on the scaffold and watch his own hands swing the axe as if he were just a spectator in the crowd. This sensory suspension was absolutely vital. Without it, the heavy knowledge that he was the permanent end of another human being's story would have crushed him. The second defense was ritualized forgiveness. If you read historical accounts, you always hear about the victim forgiving the headsman before the strike. This wasn't just a polite legal tradition, it was a mandatory psychological lifeline for the killer. By standing up, looking the headsman in the eye, granting him explicit verbal forgiveness, and paying that mercy bribe, the victim actively participated in a shared ritual. This ritual legally and emotionally framed the killing as a sworn duty, shifting the blame entirely off the headsman and turning it from a murder into an act of state bureaucracy. The third defense was total social seclusion. The headsman lived in the absolute fringes of society. He inhabited the slum, places packed with dark alehouses, total anonymity. In these dirty, winding streets, he tried to distance himself from his bloody work, but he was never, ever viewed as a normal man. He was an outcast, a pariah, a man who permanently existed in the terrifying liminal space between iron, blood, silence, and state ritual. The pre-work ritual sitting in that filthy tavern was the bridge that connected these two worlds. In the pitch-black darkness before the dawn, surrounded by the overwhelming smell of sour ale and greasy salted pork, the headsman prepared to cross over. He was transitioning from a lonely outcast of the fringe slums into the ultimate, final gesture of a monarch's will. He drank the liquid bread to fuel his agonizing broken joints, and he drank the poisonous dwell to completely numb his fractured, traumatized mind. And he did all of this while staring at the coins on the table, knowing perfectly well that the very food keeping him alive was the desperate price paid by a victim hoping for a clean, swift end. But what happens when the mechanics of mercy fail? What happens when the publican mixes the dwell wrong, or the headsman's nerves are just too frayed? The results were etched into the history of the Tower of London as acts of supreme, unforgivable butchery. These were not just little accidents. They were the direct, gruesome consequence of a man whose central nervous system was desperately fighting to maintain the brutal physics of a heavy axe while completely overwhelmed by extreme intoxication and blinding physical pain. Let's look at one of the most horrifying examples in history, the execution of Margaret Pole in 1441. She was 65 years old. She was a woman of royal blood, and because the crown feared a massive public riot, they decided to execute her away from the massive crowds, putting her on a smaller, more intimate scaffold on Tower Green. The executioner assigned to kill her was described in historical records as inexperienced. Imagine the pressure. He's standing inches away from high royalty. The space is small. The psychological pressure of the task is bearing down on him. Did he drink too much dwale? Or was he terrified and didn't drink enough of it, leaving him completely paralyzed by fear? We don't know the exact chemical imbalance in his blood that morning, but we know the result. The pressure completely broke his mind. He raised the heavy 7-pound axe. He swung it down, and he missed her neck entirely. The massive steel wedge slammed directly on the 65-year-old woman's shoulder. The ensuing scene is pure nightmare fuel. The executioner completely lost control. In a state of total motor and psychological collapse, he frantically hacked at the screaming woman's head and shoulders 11 separate times before he finally succeeded. This bloody, chaotic slaughter was the exact butcherly state that
the mercy bribe was specifically invented to prevent. The chemical balance failed, and the scaffold turned into a horror show. But sometimes the horror wasn't an accident. Sometimes the intoxication was weaponized on purpose. And that brings us to the chilling death of Thomas Cromwell in 1540. Thomas Cromwell was Henry VIII's chief minister. He was a ruthless politician who had orchestrated dozens of executions himself. He knew exactly how the system worked. He knew about the dwale. He knew about the mercy bribe. But Cromwell had made a lot of very powerful enemies. And when he fell from grace, those enemies decided to use the dark economy of the scaffold against him. Instead of paying a mercy bribe for a clean death, Cromwell's enemies secretly paid the executioner a massive sum of money to get absolutely blindingly drunk the night before. This was a negative bribe. They wanted to ensure that the headsman was far too intoxicated to maintain any kind of physical steadiness. They deliberately sabotaged the delicate balance of the liquid bread and the dwale. The result was agonizing. The executioner arrived at the block as a ragged, staggering mess. When he swung the axe at the former chief minister, it was a catastrophe. Historical records describe a ragged performance resulting in multiple unsteady blows. Because of his enemy's bribe, Cromwell was subjected to a prolonged, torturous display of absolute incompetence. It was a calculated act of post-mortem vengeance. It perfectly highlights just how incredibly fragile the headsman's functional drunkenness really was. A few extra coins for a few extra pints of poisoned ale could turn a swift execution into an agonizing mutilation. All of these dark deals, the bribes, the poisons, the plotting, they all traced back to the same place, the sociology of the fringe tavern. The alehouse near the tower wasn't just a place for a tired worker to get a drink. It was the central node in the dark, hidden economy of Tudor London. Establishments like the famous Tiger Tavern or the various nameless alehouses clustered around Trinity Square served as the primary meeting points for everyone involved in the business of death. This is where the jailers drank. This is where the execution hid. And this is where the desperate families of the condemned came creeping in the dark. It was in these smoky, stinking rooms that the mercy bribes were quietly negotiated over wooden tables. It was here that the publican, acting as a black market apothecary, carefully measured out the henbane and hemlock to prepare the dwale. The atmosphere inside these taverns was utterly unique. It was a place defined by pure anonymity, a place with very few friends and absolutely zero confidence. The executioner was a regular customer, but he was completely ignored by everyone else. His presence was only tolerated because society secretly knew he was a brutal necessity. Picture the scene in those pre-dawn hours. The tavern is completely silent. The only sound is the heavy breathing of the executioner as he forces down his liquid bread. Suddenly, the tavern door creaks open. A messenger, sent by the family of a man scheduled to die at noon, steps out of the fog. He doesn't look at the executioner. He walks straight to the publican and silently slides a heavy purse of coins across the sticky wood. The message is unspoken, but completely understood. Ensure the man in the corner is well fed and perfectly steady this morning. Every sensory detail of this pre-work meal was a grim, disgusting
disgusting foreshadowing of the blood that would flow later that day. Look at the drink itself. It was a thick, highly opaque liquid, usually a sickly brownish-white color from all the raw wheat flour and active yeast, served in a massive, heavy earthenware steam. Smell it. It didn't smell like beer. It gave off a cloying, deeply medicinal scent from the poisonous henbane and hemlock, violently clashing with the heavy saltiness of the pork and the sour rot of the ale. And the sound, just the heavy, dull thud of the earthenware rug hitting the table in the dead silence of a man who knows exactly what he has to do. He sits there, entirely alone, knowing that in just a few short hours, he will be standing over a blood-stained block, his mind entirely suspended in a toxic chemical fog, while his broken body performs the final gesture of a monarch's will. The life of a professional headsman in the 1500s was nothing short of a masterclass in the systematic, absolute destruction of the human spirit and the human body. We look back at history and see the grand castles, the kings, the absolute power of the Tudor dynasty, but the terrifying reality on the ground was that the ultimate stability of the entire Tudor scaffold rested on a highly precarious foundation of massive intoxication and desperate secret bribes. The executioner was not the cold-blooded, emotionless killer you see in movies. He was a broken, traumatized tactical athlete. He was a man who required staggering quantities of liquid bread and incredibly dangerous doses of dwale just to sustain the brutal physical forces and the crushing psychological weight demanded by his office. And the absolute darkest twist of all, the fact that the victim's own family voluntarily paid for this numbing, poisonous ritual, reveals something profound about the era. It shows us a society that completely understood its own terrifying fallibility of its justice system. The families knew the truth. They knew that the absolute will of the monarch was being carried out by a man whose hands were shaking uncontrollably from chronic nerve damage and whose mind was a war zone of moral injury and massive pharmacological suppression. When the sun finally began to rise over the smog of Tower Hill and that headsman slowly emerged from the foul-smelling tavern, he wasn't really human anymore. He was a man chemically reconstructed to be a blind instrument of the state. He was fueled, quite literally, by the financial mercy of the very people he was destined to destroy. The true history of the Tudor Acts is not a glorious story of precision, power, or royal justice. It is a miserable, haunting story of heavy iron, spilled blood, and the desperate, suffocating, numbing fog of the dwale. So the next time you picture a towering executioner in a black hood, wipe that image from your mind. Replace it with the truth. Picture a terrified, physically broken, heavily poisoned man desperately trying to drink away his own humanity before the sun comes up. If this dark journey into the hidden horrors of history kept you glued to the screen, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss a deep dive into the mysteries they don't teach you in school. And if you want to see how these exact same psychological tactics were used by soldiers facing the horrors of the trenches in World War I, you need to click on the video on your screen right now. I'll see you over there.